All right. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to another installment of the Stablecoin Solution Show, the first and only show on X dedicated to talking all things stablecoins. I'm trying a new format today. We've been running these every Friday as live X Spaces. Thought I would introduce a little video content and see how that goes over. There is a lot to talk about in the space right now when it comes to stablecoins, and let's jump into the conversation. First of all, the war in Iran. The war in Iran has obviously been very disruptive to the crypto and broader security markets, and there's been a lot of uncertainty around the globe. I put out a piece this week where I discussed that I think that stablecoins will be the third act for the dollar. That piece got a lot of traction, got almost 6,500 views, ton of bookmarks, and a lot of great positive feedback. So thank you to everyone who interacted with that piece. For those who are not familiar with the piece, it is available in my X feed. The end of the petro era and the rise of the digital dollar. I basically walked through, there are three acts to the dollar. The first act of dollar dominance started with the Bretton Woods Accord, which happened during the end of the World War II era. A bunch of nations got together, Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, decided to hash out a new global monetary reserve currency system, and they built that system over the dollar. And the whole premise of that system was that the dollar would be backed by gold. This enabled the dollar and the United States to be able to carry, obviously, a lot of power around the world, which fueled the post-World War II reconstruction of the world and ushered in the baby boomer era, which was the most prosperous era in Western civilization. And this worked for a long time. It worked for about 30 years until countries started to get concerned about the gold backing of the dollar, started to want to extract their dollars back out and exchange their dollars for gold, I should say. When this became a concern was during the Nixon administration, which then nicely pivots into the second act of the dollar. Nixon decided in 1973-74, I think it happened actually in 72, but the negotiations on that second act of the dollar followed that. But what happened is Nixon decided that it was time to take the US dollar off the gold standard. He did it abruptly on a Sunday night with an announcement, and that triggered a new dollar dominance era, which has lasted for about 50 years, and that is the petrodollar, Act 2 of the dollar world reserve currency. Essentially, what happened during that era is that Kissinger, who was acting at the time on behalf of President Nixon, went overseas to Saudi Arabia, and he negotiated a deal with the Saudis in which oil would be priced in dollars, and that carried over throughout the Gulf nations, and that created a flywheel between Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf nations where oil purchases were all dollarized, which created a demand for U.S. treasuries, which created a security apparatus in which the Saudis could buy weapons from the United States, could lean on the United States for protection of the region. And this lasted, obviously, with a lot of hiccups along the way, including the Kuwait invasion by Iraq and so forth. This took us all the way through this decade, where the dollar has been the primary vehicle for oil purchases and oil commerce. We've seen that system start to deteriorate over the last, say, 5 to 10 years, where other nations have started to seek out alternatives to the dollar. A lot of this was sanctions-based. One of the big fighting points in the Iran war was the U.S. sanctions on oil. A lot of nations were starting to turn to the Chinese yuan, and we had the whole BRICS conversation, which has been a threat to the dollar's world reserve currency dominance. Well, the thesis of the article that I put out this week basically talks about the pivot that is happening, in my opinion, right now, and Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, I think, is well aware of this pivot. Every time the dollar has had to make a new pivot with respect to maintaining dollar dominance, it seems that the groundwork has been laid in advance of that pivot. Every Treasury Secretary is tasked with making sure that people understand the dollar is the strongest currency in the world. The dollar is never going to debase itself out of existence. We're never going to default on the dollar and our massive debts. And we're going to continue to print money in infinity, and everyone can trust that the dollar is king. That's the job of every Treasury Secretary, and Scott Bessent's job is no different. But I think with the Genius Act, which came out in July of 2025, Scott Bessent saw an opening to make a pivot from the petrodollar system, which clearly was starting to go into decline. I note in my piece that we've seen a steady decline in global demand for U.S. Treasuries. We've seen other nations distance themselves from the dollar-based petro economy. And this Iran war that Trump and the White House executed this month was probably the last nail in the coffin of the petrodollar system, which has opened the door to Act 3. Act 3 is where I believe we see the dollar pivot from the world reserve currency that was built on the petrodollar to now a digital dollar stablecoin world reserve currency platform. Now, there's a few things at play in this that people need to understand. Number one, this is not an immediate switch. It's not like you just flip the switch and we go from petrodollar economy to digital dollar economy. This is going to take time. We're still actually rolling out the Genius Act requirements for how these stable coins that I talk about all the time are going to be the flywheel for Treasury demand around the world. But here's how I think the pieces on the chessboard are moving. It's clear that the Gulf region no longer feels like the United States' involvement in that region is beneficial to both sides. There's been a lot of destruction, a lot of it obviously at the hands of Iran. It's very clear from the reports that Iran has struck other Gulf nations and destroyed a lot of infrastructure in these countries. And the United States was supposed to be there as a protector of that region in exchange for this accord that happened back in the 70s with Nixon and Kissinger, that the petrodollar would be the dominant currency and that the United States would make sure that there's stability in the region to keep the oil flowing, the dollars pumping, and the Treasury demand. And we needed this for 50 years because it was the engine that built our massive, massive deficits, because we could easily continue to add to our national debt by way of this petro-oil Treasury flywheel. Well, now the war has exposed that obviously Iran is looking at different financial arrangements for how oil will be transacted. China is becoming more of a relevant player in the oil markets, with more countries being open to accepting Chinese yuan as payment for oil. We're now seeing recent reports that Iran is taxing passage on the Strait of Hormuz through Bitcoin. So clearly the dollar is gradually, if not accelerating, its decline as the petrodollar standard, the global reserve currency. At the same time, there are negotiations about bases in that region that the United States has had for a long time that have been this assurance of security in the region, may not be on the front burner as a priority for the United States anymore. And these Gulf countries that got inundated with all these drone and missile attacks certainly are starting to think about their relationship to the United States and their security assurances. So now this creates a paradigm shift where at the close of this piece, my premise is that the United States is going to become more of a regional superpower, that they're going to consolidate their power in this hemisphere, primarily focused on South America, although there's been lots of talk about Canada and making Canada the 51st state. Canada's already started to hedge against dependence on the United States by entering into trade accords with India and China. And that distancing from the United States is also another thing that's not going to be a switch that's going to flip overnight, but you can see that gradual distancing. But one thing that's undeniable is that South America is predominantly a dollar-based part of the hemisphere. And many of the countries in South America have already adopted the dollar as a standard. So it is not implausible to see stablecoins under the Genius Act, which are nothing more than digital dollars, which are backed one-to-one by U.S. Treasuries, which for those who haven't been in the space or are unfamiliar with what's going on here, the Genius Act created a flywheel effect where every digital dollar stablecoin created, be it USDC, be it the Tether version of the US compliant stablecoin, creates a demand for a treasury. So obviously, Besant believes that this is going to be maybe $2 to $3 trillion in total treasury stablecoin output, and that this will potentially be the catalyst that makes that transition from Act 2, the petrodollar era, to Act 3, the Genius Act stablecoin era. And the demand for those stablecoins will come from countries outside the United States, African countries who depend on the dollar. They'll have easy access now. Debanked countries, countries where it's difficult to get the dollar, where their currency is not very stable. A digital treasury-based dollar is something that's very appealing to these people in these countries because it gives them easy onboarding and off-ramping from digital dollars. They don't have to go through their own native banks. They don't have to worry about currency conversion rates, and they can move these digital dollars faster. So if you've already got South America pretty well adopting the dollar standard, then my thesis kind of adds up that if we continue to become a more regional superpower and we start to introduce these digital dollars to countries around the world that depend on dollars, we get away from the petrodollar system and we open up a new treasury demand mechanism. This could be the thing that buys the dollar some additional time. So that is essentially the premise of that. If you want to read the article, it's available both to read and you can hear it on audio on X. Just go to my profile and you'll see it there. Another major story that I'm talking about this week, the White House has exposed through a report that was released this week that the banking lobby's doomsday scenarios for whether consumers can earn yield on stablecoins may have been exaggerated just a touch and that the numbers do not necessarily add up. The point of this report, and there is one quote in there that I like, that I'll jump to, that I think really catches the essence of what's going on here, is this quote from the report. Forgive me while I find it. Where did you go? Quote. So the premise of the story is pretty clear. The Council of Economic Advisors ran the numbers, and the bank's trillion-dollar threat with respect to what earning consumer yield on stablecoins would do to bank deposits, would do to customer deposits, and would do to a flight of money outside of the banking system has largely been overblown as a destabilizing effect. The yield prohibition in the Genius Act and its proposed reinforcement through the Clarity Act may be motivated by the concern that competitive stablecoin returns will draw deposits out of the banking system. I have been talking for weeks about this, and that I think that this is largely overblown. I think that this flight of deposits and this loss is essentially being treated as a as hyperbolic talk to try and kill any chance that consumers can earn yield for one reason and one reason alone. The banks don't want competition, because as I've been saying for weeks, the banks pay on average consumers less than 1% interest on their deposits, and there are more appealing alternatives out there. Of course, you can put your money in money markets, etc. But if you want to play in the stablecoin space through Coinbase and their arrangement with Circle, you can get pretty nice returns of 4 to 5% on your stablecoins through Coinbase. The banks don't like this, and the banks have been fighting tooth and nail in backdoor conversations, both with the crypto sector and Congress, to try and close this loophole. I've been pretty vocal about the fact that all this backdoor conversation is alarming to me, because the consumer has been locked out of what's really in the Clarity Act markup, which is supposed to be brought out sometime in mid-April for a final markup and debate by the Senate Banking Committee. We have had several big players in the sector, including the SEC chair and Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary. Anytime you talk about stablecoins, you're going to always have Scott Bessent in the mix because he's very bullish on stablecoins. But he came out and he put out an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal saying that it's time Congress needs to get the Clarity Act done. And this actually dovetails pretty nicely into the timing of this report that the White House put out. At baseline collaboration, eliminating stablecoin yield increases bank lending by $2.1 billion, which represents a net increase of 0.02% of total loans. Producing lending effects in the hundreds of billions requires simultaneously assuming that stablecoin share in the market's sextuples, all reserves shift into segregated deposits, and the Federal Reserve abandons its ample reserves framework. This is all implausible because basically what the banking lobby has done is they've essentially lumped together every possible doomsday scenario into this to try to scare people in Congress that if consumers have access to other options, that they will take their money, all their money out of banks, they will run to stable coins for yield, and that this will create a collapse in lending and the availability of money for community banks. The article is out there. It's again in my X profile if you want to read it or play it back on audio, but it makes a pretty compelling case that this is largely overblown. Now, the banks have pushed back and said that the White House's report is not accurate with respect to how they are framing this subject. Regardless of what side of the debate you're on, it does beg the question for Congress. Number one, can the consumer please see the yield compromise? Because remember, I've talked about this for several weeks. I've written about it. The compromise that's being hashed out, you got two sides. You got the crypto sector led by Coinbase, and you got the bank lobby that want two different things from this Clarity Act. The Genius Act made it clear when it was signed into law that issuers cannot directly pay yield on stablecoins. However, there was this opening where platforms like Coinbase could pay rewards in the form of incentives for people to custody their USDC on Coinbase and earn that nice yield. The banks hate this. The banks have been very vocal that this is going to cause a flight of deposits. We have to put an end to this. Okay. The other side of it, Coinbase. They got shareholders. They got a sweet profit margin and a great arrangement with Circle, and they've made a ton of money off of this arrangement, and they clearly don't want to see this arrangement end, so they've been fighting tooth and nail. So there was a compromise reached. Passive yield would be prohibited, which means just parking your stable coins on something like Coinbase is not enough to get you the yield because that's too much like having a bank deposit. Bank deposits, according to the bank sector, are protected by FDIC insurance. I've talked about the fact that on stable coins, you don't necessarily need to have that FDIC protection because every stable coin's backed and fully reserved by a treasury asset. But nevertheless, the fear-mongering has continued. So now the existential question for Congress is, what are you going to do about this? Are you going to ban all passive yield, and are you going to make it activity-based rewards? And are you going to have this very vague language that if it looks and walks like a bank deposit, but they're calling it a reward program, that you're going to be subject to sanctions under the Clarity and the Genius Act? That's the problem right now because they've left it very vague in how to interpret what the line is between passive and active and what looks and smells and walks like a bank deposit. So that has been a bone of contention. Now everyone's talking about the fact they've got it all worked out in closed-door meetings. We, of course, as the public, have not seen what the hell they're talking about. Would love to see the language so that we can know as consumers because, hey, I'm here to fight for the consumer because I think the consumer with stable coins has an opportunity finally to break away from the big banks and their free extraction model. If you have not downloaded my book yet, Make Your Wallet Your Bank, I highly encourage you to do that. That is in my pinned tweet in my profile. It's a free download. It's a guide that talks about a financial system built over stable coins that allows the consumer to have options that work around the banks and their toll booth fee extraction economy. Banks charge money at every step of the way when it comes to holding your money, moving your money, the hidden fees, the overdraft fees. All this stuff is baked into the banking profit model, and that's exactly why they want to keep your deposits right there in the banks with no competition, because they don't want any pressure on having to cut their fees or pay higher yield. Because what the banks do with that deposit that's sitting in your account is they lend it out 5 and 6 times in the open market, and they make interest on car loans and so forth. So they make a higher rate of return on your money than you do. And when they make that higher rate of return, they don't want the pressure in the marketplace to have to offer you a little more on your deposits in order to justify that arrangement. And that's what the stablecoin yield conversation does. It puts pressure on the banks. So, soft shill, it's going to cost you an email address, and you can get a free copy of my guide. My guide talks about an alternative to this, breaking away from the bank toll booth economy, spending in stables, which allows you to move your money faster and cheaper and instantly over stable coins, breaking away from the bank infrastructure, taking the savings that you're going to make on moving your money on the bank fees that are extracted from your money, and deploying that in a 2-asset strategy. I happen to talk about in this book the 2-asset strategy being spend in stables, then take those savings that you realize and stack in sats. Now, whether you believe it's gold, whether you believe it's ETFs, whether you believe it's equities, whatever it is, Bitcoin, if you have a 2-asset strategy, you're taking the savings from your stable coins because you're breaking away from the bank fee extraction model, and you're getting the benefit of using those savings to stack in whatever risk asset you believe will be the winner. Because here is the reality. The dollar is debasing at an extraordinarily fast rate. We're actually in a conversation right now with the president's new budget where he wants to deploy another $1.5 trillion in defense spending. Guess who's going to pay for that? We're going to pay for that because we're going to continue to debase our currency, which means our dollar will buy less. We're going to print more money to accomplish this. And if we don't have a treasury demand, then we're going to have to pay a higher rate on the treasuries that we utilize, that pay interest, that finance all that debt. So if the interest on our debt becomes too expensive to pay back because the treasury percentage rates are too high, well, this obviously puts us in a real problem. And there are a lot of people talking about that we are kind of entering that fourth turning of the dollar system where we are reaching unsustainable deficits. And those unsustainable deficits are now going to make it very difficult for people. So that's the essential premise. Spend in stables, stack in sats, make your wallet your bank, because that breaks you away from the banking model. Now, another story that I'm covering this week, which also has me upset, is everyone's talking about the fact we're so close to getting the Clarity Act done. That's great. Everyone's talking about the fact that there are several challenges in getting the Clarity Act done, one of which is this yield on stablecoin debate. Where is this yield coming from? How is Coinbase paying this yield? Banks, at least you know how you're getting your interest. When you put your money in these yield-bearing things, the higher the yield, the more the risk. This debate has been going on endlessly. We've seen it in all different angles, from the Terra Luna collapse, so forth. So one of the big problems has been stablecoin yield. And the second problem has been the Trump family and their involvement in crypto, and whether that potentially presents conflicts, and that they have made a lot of money off of crypto. So a lot of the Senate Democrats have been calling for ethics provisions in the Clarity Act to prevent that type of relationship between the Trump family, Trump indirectly, and the crypto sector. And there's been concerns about DeFi. We've had a lot of DeFi exploits of late, consumer protections and disclosures in DeFi. So then what happens yesterday? We have this breaking story. World Liberty Financial. World Liberty Financial, just as we're in the process of coming to the finish line on the Clarity Act, where we're trying to get this thing to the markup in mid-April, to get it passed through the Senate, to get it to the president's desk. Now we have this explosion that was broke last night. World Liberty, a DeFi venture affiliated with the Trump family, pledged approximately, according to reports, 5 billion of its own WLFI governance tokens as collateral on the Dolomite lending protocol, DeFi protocol, borrowed roughly 75 million in stablecoins, 65.4 million in USD1, which is that WorldFi stablecoin, 10.3 million in USDC, which is the Circle stablecoin, with approximately 15 million subsequently repaid. More than 40 million of those proceeds were routed out to Coinbase Prime, to their institutional custody, the OTC arm of Coinbase. And as a direct consequence of this move, the USD1 lending pool on Dolomite was pushed to a utilization rate of approximately 93%, which means all the liquidity left. So the consumers who had put their USD1 stablecoins in this DeFi protocol and were earning yield, were earning a nice yield, apparently can't get their money out right now because all the liquidity's been drained. So now the consumer is locked out of this. This caused the WLFI token to fall nearly 10%. Following this information, CoinDesk has reported this story. I put out a piece this morning, which again is available in my profile. If you want to read more about what's going on there, the premise of my piece is we don't know the full facts of what happened here. We're not, and I'm not saying that anything illegal happened here at this point because we don't have all the information. However, we have the on-chain data which shows the movements, and the movements are concerning. There's a lot of red flags with the way this went down, and the timing of this could not be worse, because if we're trying to get clarity, the SEC wants the Clarity Act to be passed, the CFTC wants the Clarity Act to be passed, Scott Bessent wants the Clarity Act to be passed, the crypto sector wants the Clarity Act to be passed. We all want clarity when it comes to crypto market structure. The White House wants to get this done. We don't want to lose this innovation overseas. We don't want to miss this window to have clear legislation on the books, as opposed to being back to the possibility of a new regulatory power coming in at the SEC and the CFTC and fucking this all up, where now the consumer has to worry about these regulations all being changed and walked back, and that'll hurt growth in the sector. So all this pressure to get the Clarity Act done, the timing of this move last night could not have been worse for all of that, because now this gives ammunition to the Senate Democrats who are already skeptical about crypto, who are already skeptical about DeFi, who are skeptical about Trump's and the Trump family's hands in crypto and what they're making off of crypto, the ethics concerns, the DeFi concerns, the stablecoin yield concerns, and now right on the verge of a Senate debate markup on this, we have this World Liberty story break. They are definitely going to get as much mileage as they can out of this to say, nope, we don't need this. We shouldn't pass this as it's currently written. We need stricter ethics provisions, which I think for Trump will be a deal breaker. I don't think he'll ever agree to that. We need to further tighten the yield parameters on stablecoins. This is unfortunate. This is a unforced error that I think is really going to do damage to the possibility. Now, at this point, since we haven't seen the markup on what the hell is in the stablecoin yield provisions of the Clarity Act, hasn't been publicly released yet to my knowledge. We're still relying on this backdoor chatter. Some people are saying, you know what, scrap the whole Clarity Act, because at this point we're probably better off without it. And that's going to probably start to get more and more traction in the space, as well as a strong narrative, because we have seen the destruction of all the arguments that were being made as to why we need this. DeFi is good. Obviously, I'm a big proponent of DeFi, but when we see stuff like this happen, it really gives a lot of ammunition to the other side to want to legislate this stuff out of existence. So I can see Elizabeth Warren and her crew, Senate Banking Committee Dems, jump all over this news and use this as another talking point to try and kill the progress of the Clarity Act. So I'm hopeful that World Liberty comes out with a statement publicly about what the hell happened here, that there is some kind of reason for this, and that liquidity is not going to hurt the consumer, and that massive liquidity drain, which now is putting the consumer who has put their tokens in that protocol, they're unable to get their money out if they want it. They need to come out and clear the air on this, and they need to do it as soon as possible, because we're coming up on the markup session for this in the Senate Banking Committee. And if we don't get the Clarity Act through by May, several people in Congress have said the window is going to close. We're going to be bogged down in the midterms, and we're not going to have an opportunity to get this thing off the ground. So look, stablecoin demand, stablecoin volume continues to grow at record numbers. There is no denying that it is going to be an integral part of the financial system. I've made my case that I think it's the third act for the dollar. I think it is the logical flywheel, as I put in that piece talking about the end of the petrodollar system and the dollar's third act. I think that dovetails nicely into the report that we saw from the White House, that consumers should have options on where they can get yield on stablecoins, but it's got to be with clear, safe on-ramps, off-ramps, details, and aggressive yield is certainly going to be a red flag every time you talk about that. But that should not be a reason to totally kill the consumer opportunity for yield, as much as the banks want to kill that, which has been an ongoing thread that I've been talking about for a long time. I think they've overplayed, and that's the other piece that I had put out talking about this White House report, how it has exaggerated what the hell is going on here. And the banks are doing that purposely to scare people in Congress who they've donated a lot of money to influence them to protect their moat on where consumers can hold their money and earn interest, be it in the form of rewards or yield, whatever semantics you want to talk about. The banks clearly have a vested interest in protecting that moat. I think at the end of the day, they're going to lose that competitive edge, because the neobanks like Kraken and now Coinbase getting their OCC charter granted, which is also pissing off the banks. Remember, Kraken got their Fed account approved. The banks threatened to sue over that. They're not happy about Coinbase getting OCC, because they understand that there is going to be a new way for consumers to move and custody their digital dollars. The banks want a seat at that table, but they don't want to give up their fees in exchange for this new innovative technology, and that's not going to work. So I foresee this is all going to get worked out with or without the Clarity Act. We're going to see banks continue to lose their stranglehold on this fee extraction model. That dovetails nicely into the third piece I talked about today, which is this World Liberty debacle. Look, we just did not need this right now. The timing of this could not have been worse, as we're trying to get the Clarity Act over the goal line. I don't know. Maybe this is a blessing for the sector. Maybe the Clarity Act doesn't get done, and maybe we just rely on the regulators to fill in how this is all going to play out, and maybe we try again next time in the future. But if you had any hopes of the Clarity Act, and if you were bullish on the Clarity Act being a net positive market structure, and there is one side of this that I think we cannot ignore. A lot of the big players in the sector, the institutional players, have been waiting for the Clarity Act to pass, because they're not going to make massive investments and push forward with their goals and initiatives unless they are comfortable, unless their lawyers are comfortable that they can advise them that there is true market clarity here, and that what you're building today is not subject to an enforcement letter 3-4 years from now, when another administration comes in and we have a new SEC chair potentially, or a new CFTC regime, and all of this then goes to hell because there's no law, because it's harder to reverse the law when it's on the books. It's easier to just change the regulation and the regulatory framework, because that is subject to just revised memos and revised disclosures from the regulators. So that's the risk. If we don't get this done, we lose the mass adoption that market structure clarity would bring to the sector, because we're now left in this regulatory clarity without the chef's kiss of the White House and Congress approving digital assets. So it only further legitimizes this stuff. However, this World Liberty financial news really presents a hurdle. So I'm going to be keeping my eye on this. I hope they come out with a statement clarifying. For everyone that tuned in today, thank you. I hope you enjoyed this new format. I think I kind of like it, because I get to share a lot of stuff on screen, And I think it is something that I can clip up and send out to everyone in shorter form. This is available on YouTube to rewatch. And of course, you can rewatch it on X. And for all of you who have not done so already, please take a moment to go to my pinned tweet, download the free guide. Like I said, it costs you nothing but an email address. Trying to build a community here with Stablecoin Solutions that empowers the consumer to understand that they have alternatives to move their money cheaper and faster than the banks, to break away from the banks and their fee extraction toll booth model, to spend in stables, realize those savings in a two-asset strategy. One of those two-asset strategies could be stacking in sats, which is building towards the ultimate potential demise of the dollar, and then making your wallet your bank, which insulates you, if you do it right and if you do it safely, from a lot of the risk contagion that comes with having your money on crypto exchanges and banks and so forth. And we saw that with this recent concern. There was an urgent meeting called between Treasury and the Fed about Anthropic's new model and what it might do to the banking sector and to the finance sector with respect to threat exposure. AI is getting more and more robust at finding vulnerabilities in these platforms. And apparently there's something in that code that's really got all the finance people concerned. So self-custody seems to be the antidote to that, because remember, most all banks still offer the consumer security via two-factor authentication on your SMS text messaging platform on your phone. We all know if you're in crypto long enough, the SIM swap is a real risk. I can't believe banks still offer this to consumers, but this only reinforces that there's a serious threat vector there. The more AI starts to get integrated into our world, and the more robust AI becomes at finding these exploits, then that's going to introduce risk. So I'm also monitoring that story because I don't know what the urgent purpose of that meeting was, but I'm sure curious to know. So stay tuned. Give a like and a follow if you haven't already. Download the free guide. And please make sure that you share this with anyone who you think would benefit from this information. I run this every Friday, 9 a.m. Eastern, the Stablecoin Solution Show, the first and only show dedicated to talking all things stablecoins. To everyone out there that I see, and I see a bunch of eyes on this, I really appreciate you. Thank you for the support. Let's hope we get closer to a continued ceasefire in the region and no more violence and no more destruction, because the markets are really hoping that we can finally get beyond this and we can finally end the pain. A lot of damage has been done, but let's hope for peace so we can get back on track and that everyone can see some prosperity, some safety, and some security come out on the other side of this thing. Thank you to everyone. Again, hope for peace around the world. See you next week for another Stablecoin Solutions. Always, you can follow me and you can see all my content on the platform. If you missed anything that I posted, again, it's all available in my profile. Thanks again, everyone.